Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet scrape of a chair on a concrete floor. A woman sits in a dimly lit warehouse shivering in a cheap cotton dress sold to a monster to pay for the sins of her blood. She expects death. She expects violence. What she doesn't expect is for the devil himself to look at the scars left by her family, lower his gun, and ask a single terrifying question. The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Nora stood by the rusted bumper of her father's sedan, the drizzle matting her dark hair to her forehead. Her cheap canvas sneakers were soaking through the icy water seeping into her socks, but she didn't shift her weight. Shifting meant drawing attention. Attention in her family usually ended in a bruised jaw or a sudden sharp ringing in the ears. A few feet away, her father Arthur paced. He smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and the sharp sour tang of nervous sweat. He was chewing on a damp, unlit cigar, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a trench coat that had seen better decades. Beside him, her older brother Declan leaned against the hood of the car, tapping his knuckles against the wet metal in a rapid, spastic rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a rat trapped in a coffee can. "They're late," Declan muttered, his voice cracking on the second syllable. He wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. "You said midnight pop. It's 12:15. "Shut up, Deck," Arthur snapped, not breaking his stride. "He'll be here. A man like Leo Russo doesn't run on our time. We run on his." Nora kept her eyes on the asphalt. The yellow glow of a distant street lamp reflected in the oily puddles. She felt a strange, heavy detachment settling over her shoulders, numbing the persistent ache in her collarbone. They were selling her. She had known it for 3 days, ever since Arthur came home with a split lip and a frantic, glassy look in his eyes. He had stolen from the Russo syndicate, skimming from the docks for nearly 2 years. Declan had helped him gamble it away. The debt was a number so large it didn't even sound like money to Nora. It sounded like a life sentence. And now she was the plea deal. A pair of headlights cut through the fog, blindingly bright, casting long warped shadows across the abandoned shipyard. The low hum of a luxury engine drowned out the sound of the rain. A black SUV rolled to a stop 50 yards away. Then another, and a third. Declan stopped tapping. He shrank back against the car, suddenly looking very small. Arthur straightened up, forcing his shoulders back in a pathetic pantomime of dignity. Nora finally looked up. 4 men stepped out of the vehicles. 3 were broad-built like brick walls draped in expensive tailored suits. They carried umbrellas, but their free hands hovered near their waistbands. The 4th man didn't bother with an umbrella. Leo Russo. He wasn't a caricature. There were no flashy rings on his fingers, no overgelled hair. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat over a simple black turtleneck. His face was sharp-etched with the kind of hard, flat exhaustion that came from carrying too much violent responsibility. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a decade. Yet he moved with a fluid, lethal economy. Every step was deliberate. The gravel crunched under his leather shoes loud in the damp air. Arthur stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Russo, sir!" Leo didn't look at Arthur. His dark eyes flicked over the rusted sedan, over the trembling Declan, and finally they landed on Nora. They were flat, unreadable. He looked at her the way someone might look at a rusted hubcap on the side of the road, mildly observant, completely indifferent. "Arthur," Leo said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. It barely carried over the rain, yet it commanded absolute silence. "You said you had a proposition to settle the ledger." "Yes." "Yes, sir." Arthur reached back, grabbing Nora by the elbow. His grip was entirely too tight. His blunt fingernails dug into the soft flesh of her inner arm as he yanked her forward. Nora stumbled, her wet sneaker slipping on the pavement, but she caught herself. She didn't make a sound. She refused to give them that. "My daughter." Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly, before he forced a boisterous, sickening tone of salesmanship into it. "Nora, she's quiet, keeps her head down. She can clean, she can cook, she can—" "I don't run a maid service, Arthur," Leo interrupted. The boredom in his voice was absolute. "You owe me $600,000. A maid costs me $15 an hour. The math doesn't work out. She's collateral." Arthur rushed out, his face flushing red. "Keep her. Do what you want. Sell her down the line to those contacts you have down south. She's 24. Never caused a problem. She covers the debt, Leo. Please." Nora felt a drop of cold rain slide down her neck, tracing the edge of the jagged, raised skin hidden beneath the collar of her oversized sweater. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at Declan, who was staring fixedly at his own shoes, utterly complicit in his silence. She just looked at Leo Russo's chest. Leo finally shifted his gaze back to Arthur. "You're trading your own blood to save your hands." It wasn't a question. It was a sterile observation. "A man has to survive." Arthur justified, his voice thinning out. Leo stared at him for 3 long, agonizing seconds. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to one of the men flanking him. The man stepped forward, reaching inside his jacket. Declan flinched violently, throwing his hands up, but the man didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger and a fountain pen. He handed them to Arthur. "Sign the debt over," Leo said. "The girl comes with me. If I ever see your face in my city again, I'll take the debt out of your spine. Understood?" "Yes. God, yes, thank you." Arthur practically scrambled to sign the ledger, the rain smearing the ink. He didn't look back at Nora. He shoved the book back to the guard, grabbed Declan by the jacket, and practically dragged him into the driver's seat of the sedan. The engine choked, sputtered, and roared to life. Tires spun on the wet pavement, spraying filthy water over Nora's ankles as her father and brother fled. The taillights faded into the fog. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was heavy. Nora stood alone. The rain was picking up, soaking through her sweater, chilling her to the bone. She waited for the rough hands. She waited to be shoved into the trunk of the SUV. She had spent the last 3 days visualizing this exact moment, turning off every emotional receptor in her brain, just to survive the terror of it. Leo Russo took a step closer. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. Up close, he smelled of ozone rain and a very faint, expensive sandalwood. "Get in the car," he said. Not a yell, just a quiet command. He didn't grab her. He turned his back to her and walked toward the center SUV. One of his men opened the rear door. Leo slid in. Nora swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move. 1 step, then another. She climbed into the back seat, sinking into the impossibly soft leather. The door shut behind her with a heavy final thud, cutting off the sound of the rain. The trap had closed. The interior of the SUV was suffocatingly warm. The sudden blast of the heater against Nora's soaked clothes made her shiver violently. She clamped her jaw shut, refusing to let her teeth chatter. Leo sat beside her, separated by the wide center console. He had an iPad resting on his knee, his thumb casually scrolling through what looked like shipping manifests. He completely ignored her. The glass divider separating the back from the driver was rolled up. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers. Nora stared at the back of the driver's headrest. Her mind was a static buzz. Why wasn't he restraining her? Why the back seat and not the trunk? The unpredictability made her stomach churn with a sickening nausea. Cynicism had been her armor for years, but cynicism required a predictable pattern of abuse. Arthur and Declan were predictable. They were weak, selfish, and violent. Leo Russo was a blank wall. 20 minutes later, the SUV slowed, turning onto a private tree-lined road. Wrought iron gates swung open smoothly. The tires shifted from asphalt to perfectly raked gravel. They stopped in front of a sprawling, brutalist stone house. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, modern, cold, and heavily guarded. Men in dark jackets stood under the eaves, smoking cigarettes, their eyes tracking the vehicle. The door opened. The cold air rushed back in. "Out," Leo said, stepping onto the driveway. Nora scrambled out her wet shoes, squeaking on the stone. She followed him into the house. The interior was a stark contrast to the exterior. It was warm lit with low amber lighting. The floors were dark polished mahogany. The air smelled of espresso and wood smoke. It felt aggressively normal. Leo didn't pause in the foyer. He walked straight down a long hallway and opened double doors at the end, stepping into a large office. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. A massive oak desk sat in the center. A fire crackled in a stone hearth to the right. Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather wingback chairs in front of the desk. Nora walked over and sat down. She kept her knees pressed tightly together, her hands folded rigidly in her lap. Her wet sweater clung uncomfortably to her skin, the heavy damp wool pulling at her left shoulder. She tried to adjust it, discreetly wincing, as the fabric rubbed against the tender, ruined flesh beneath. Leo walked around to his side of the desk but didn't sit. He leaned against the edge, crossing his arms over his chest. He studied her. For the first time, he really looked at her. His gaze tracked from her soaking wet hair to her white bloodless knuckles, and finally to her face. "You didn't scream," he said. The observation hung in the quiet room. "When he handed you over, most people scream, or beg. You just stood there." Nora stared at his chin. Would it have mattered? No. Then why waste the breath? A muscle flickered in Leo's jaw. He reached over to a crystal decanter on his desk, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass, and held it out to her. "Drink this. You're shaking." Nora looked at the glass. Paranoia spiked in her chest. Is it drugged? Is it a test? She looked up, meeting his eyes. They were completely devoid of the sadistic gleam she was used to seeing in men who held power over her. They were just tired. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the glass. The crystal was heavy. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. The whiskey burned like liquid fire down her throat, settling deep in her stomach. It brought a flush of heat to her skin. She coughed, lowering the glass. "Your father owes me money." "You don't," Leo said quietly. He uncrossed his arms. "I don't traffic women, Nora. I run guns, I run cargo, I extort the corrupt. I don't buy people. Arthur knew that. He brought you here as a Hail Mary to stall me before I sent men to burn his house down." Nora froze. The glass in her hand felt suddenly slippery. You You aren't keeping me. I'm keeping you here tonight because it's pouring, and you look like you're going to pass out, Leo corrected smoothly. Tomorrow I give you a few thousand in cash, you get on a bus, and you disappear. Because by noon, tomorrow your father and your brother are going to be dead. The words were spoken with the casual certainty of someone discussing the weather forecast. Nora didn't react with horror. She didn't gasp. Instead, a strange, disjointed laugh pushed its way up her throat. It was a harsh, ugly sound, dry and grating. It echoed in the quiet office, startling even her. Leo's brow furrowed. You find that funny? No, Nora choked out, shaking her head. The laughter died as quickly as it came, leaving behind a profound, suffocating bitterness. I find it ironic. You think you're punishing them. A bullet to the back of the head is generally considered a punishment, yes. You think they care. Nora's voice rose, the numb shell finally cracking. The whiskey had loosened the tight band around her chest, just enough to let the venom out. You think Arthur brought me here to stall you? He didn't bring me here to stall you, Mr. Russo. He brought me here to distract you. While you're looking at me figuring out what to do with the baggage, they aren't going back to that house. They're gone. Leo's expression hardened. My men are tracking their car right now. They aren't going anywhere. You don't know him, Nora whispered. Her fingers tightened around the glass. She looked down at her lap, her breathing turning shallow. Arthur doesn't panic. Not like that. If he looked panicked, it was an act. He sold the house 3 days ago to a shell buyer. He packed Declan's bags. They were waiting for this drop to clear out of state. Leo went still. The quiet in the room shifted, turning sharp, dangerous. And how do you know that? Because they made sure I wouldn't be able to follow them. Nora set the glass down on the edge of the desk with a sharp clack. Her hands were shaking violently now, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline. She reached up to the thick cowl neck of her soaked sweater. Her fingers clumsy, she gripped the wet wool and pulled it violently downward, exposing her left shoulder, her collarbone, and the upper half of her chest. Leo's breath caught. It was a subtle, sharp intake of air, the first genuine reaction he had shown all night. The skin from the base of her neck stretching across her shoulder and down toward her heart was a landscape, a twisted, angry ruin. It was a massive burn scar, the tissue puckered shiny and horrifically uneven. It was a violent shade of pink and white, tight and raw-looking. At the center, right over her collarbone, the burn deepened into an unmistakable, deliberate brand. The melted shape of a heavy iron bolt. 2 weeks ago, Nora said, her voice dropping to a dead hollow monotone. She stared at the fire in the hearth, refusing to look at his face. Arthur realized his books were going to be audited by your men. He knew you'd find the missing $600,000. He and Declan had spent it on underground races and bad investments. They needed a fall guy. They needed a reason why the money burned. She swallowed hard. The memory smelled like gasoline. It tasted like ash. They took me to the lock-up warehouse where Arthur managed your logistics. They tied my hands to the structural pipe. Arthur poured a jerry can of accelerant over the ledger books. Declan. She closed her eyes. Declan stood too close when he dropped the lighter. The splash caught my shoulder. Leo didn't move. He didn't speak. He was an absolute statue. His dark eyes locked on the mangled flesh of her shoulder. They watched me burn for a full minute, Mr. Russo. Nora whispered the rawness in her throat, making her voice break. I screamed until I tore my vocal cords. Arthur waited until the books were ash. Then he put the fire out on me with a heavy welding blanket. The bolt from the pipe burned right into my skin. He told me that if I ever told your people the truth, he would tell you I stole the money. He said my silence was my rent. Tonight wasn't a trade. It was a disposal. She forcefully pulled the wet wool back up, hiding the scar, hiding the shame, and wrapping her arms tight around her ribs. They didn't sell me to pay the debt. They left me with you so you'd be looking at the freak they left behind while they crossed the border. My father and my brother did that. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain lashed against the heavy glass windows. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nora sat in the oversized leather chair, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the disbelief. She waited for Leo to sneer to tell her she was lying, to call her a pathetic bitch trying to save her own skin. That was how men in her world operated. Empathy was a myth. Survival was the only currency. Leo slowly pushed himself off the edge of the desk. He didn't look angry. In fact, his face was terrifyingly blank, stripped of all humanity. He walked over to the heavy oak doors of his office and pulled them open. "Matteo," he said into the hallway. A tall man with a broken nose appeared instantly. "Boss." "Call off the tracking team on Arthur's sedan. Tell them to stand down." Nora's stomach plummeted. He doesn't believe me. A wave of cold, dizzying panic washed over her. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her nails biting into the leather. She was going to be punished for lying. She braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut. Instead, Leo's voice continued eerily calm. "Wake up the cleanup crew. I want Arthur and Declan found. Check shell company property transfers in the last 72 hours. Check private airstrips, bus terminals, and underground freight lines. They have a 3-hour head start. I want them alive. And Matteo." "Yeah, boss." "When you find them, break their legs so they can't run, and bring them to the warehouse on 5th. Done." The door clicked shut. Nora opened her eyes. Leo was walking back toward the desk. He didn't look at her immediately. He picked up his own glass of whiskey, stared at the amber liquid for a second, and then set it down without drinking. "You think they went south or north?" he asked. Nora blinked her brain, struggling to catch up with the whiplash. "What?" "Your father. He's a creature of habit. Does he prefer the cold or the heat? He hates the cold," she stammered, entirely thrown off balance. "Florida. He always talked about Florida. Then we checked the southern routes first." Leo finally looked at her. The flat exhaustion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering intensity that made her breath hitch. It wasn't directed at her. It was a quiet, controlled violence safely contained behind a wall of pure discipline. "Why are you doing this?" Nora asked. Her voice sounded fragile, defensive. "You run a criminal syndicate. You kill people for money. Why do you care what they did to me? You just said I was baggage. I am a criminal." Leo agreed, easily unbuttoning his suit jacket and sitting down in the high-backed leather chair behind his desk. He steepled his fingers, watching her. "I extort. I break men who break my rules. But I have rules. A man who burns his own daughter to cover his theft isn't a man. He's a rabid dog. And I shoot rabid dogs." He paused, his gaze softening by just a fraction of an inch. "I didn't say you were baggage. I said you were brought here as a distraction. There is a difference." Nora stared at him, searching for the lie, searching for the hidden cost. "There's always a price. What do you want from me?" "Right now, I want you to take a hot shower before you catch pneumonia in my office." He pressed a button on his intercom. A moment later, a quiet older woman in a simple cardigan stepped into the room. "Maria," Leo said gently, "take our guest upstairs to the east wing. Find her some dry clothes, and bring a plate up for her. Hot food." "Yes, Mr. Russo," Maria said, offering Nora a warm, crinkled smile. "Come along, dear." Nora didn't move. Her cynical mind violently rejected the scenario. Hot food. A guest bedroom. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. She looked at Leo, her eyes wide, entirely raw and terrified. "If I go up there, what happens when the door closes?" Leo stopped typing on his phone. He looked up, catching the sheer panic in her posture. He understood immediately. "The door locks from the inside. Nora." Leo said, his voice dropping into a low, grounding register. "No one will bother you. You are not a prisoner. You are a guest in my house." She stood up slowly, her wet sneakers making a pathetic squelching sound on the rug. She felt clumsy, out of place, a street mutt dragged into a palace. She followed Maria to the door, but paused in the frame, looking back over her ruined shoulder. "When you find them," Nora said, the words tasting like ash and iron on her tongue. "Arthur and Declan." Leo paused, waiting. "I don't want you to shoot them like dogs." Her voice was no longer trembling. A dark, ugly, fundamentally broken piece of her soul finally surfaced, nurtured by years of abuse, and cemented by the burn on her skin. "I want to watch." Leo Russo didn't blink. He didn't look disgusted. A slow, dark understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the monsters that lived in the dark. "I'll make sure you have a front row seat," he promised softly. Nora turned and walked away. 10 minutes later, she stood under the scalding spray of a walk-in shower. The water beat against the marble tiles, washing away the smell of the damp warehouse, the smell of Declan's cheap cologne, and the lingering scent of ozone. When the hot water hit her scarred shoulder, it ached, a deep phantom throb that radiated down to her fingertips. She turned off the water, wrapped herself in a thick, ridiculously soft towel, and stepped into the bedroom. It was massive. A king-sized bed, heavy velvet curtains, and a tray of food resting on a small glass table by the window. A bowl of rich, steaming pasta, slices of garlic bread, a glass of water. Nora walked over to the table. She stared at the food. The smell of garlic, tomatoes, and warm bread hit her senses, sharp and overwhelming. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 3 days. Her stomach cramped violently in response. She picked up the silver fork. It was heavy, cool metal against her palm. She took a bite. The flavors exploded in her mouth, so rich, so distinctly, profoundly human, compared to the cold, sterile violence of the last few hours. And then she broke. She didn't cry gracefully. She didn't shed a single poetic tear. Nora dropped the fork. It clattered against the plate, and she doubled over, a harsh, ugly sob tearing from her throat. She fell to her knees on the plush carpet, clutching her stomach as her body violently purged the adrenaline. She dry-heaved, gasping for air, tears mixing with the shower water dripping from her hair. She cried for the mother she never knew. She cried for the father who watched her burn. She cried for the utter, terrifying realization that the safest she had ever felt in her entire life was in the hands of a Mafia boss. The breakdown was loud, messy, and imperfect. But for the first time in 24 years, Nora wasn't crying because she was being hurt. She was crying because finally the hurting had stopped. Nora woke to the sound of nothing. For a solid minute, she lay entirely rigid, beneath a heavy down comforter, her eyes locked on the unfamiliar plaster of the ceiling. In Arthur's house, mornings were violently loud. The rattle of the faulty radiator, Declan cursing at the television, the heavy, unpredictable thud of her father's boots pacing the floorboards overhead, dictating whether she needed to hide or make coffee. Here the silence was absolute. It felt thick, almost unnatural. She pushed the covers back and swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet sank into the plush carpet. On the armchair near the window, Maria had left a stack of folded clothes, dark denim jeans, a soft gray cashmere sweater, and clean underwear. Next to it was a pair of simple leather slippers. Nora walked over to the clothes, her body moving with the slow, stiff caution of a stray dog expecting a kick. She picked up the sweater. It was impossibly soft. She pressed the fabric to her face, inhaling the scent of expensive detergent and faint lavender. It didn't smell like mildew. It didn't smell like cheap beer. She dressed quickly, the cashmere sliding gently over her ruined left shoulder. It still ached, a deep, persistent throb that flared every time she lifted her arm. But the fabric didn't catch on the uneven, shiny skin the way her cheap polyester shirts used to. When she finally opened the bedroom door, the hallway was empty. Sunlight streamed through tall windows at the far end, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She walked down the wide curved staircase, instinctively keeping her weight on the edges of the steps to minimize the creaking. Old habits died hard. The ground floor smelled of roasted coffee beans and bacon. Nora followed the scent, her stomach giving a traitorous rumble. She found the kitchen at the back of the house. It was a massive industrial-grade space of brushed steel and dark granite. Leo was sitting at a heavy wooden island reading a physical newspaper. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a sliver of dark ink on his left wrist. He didn't look like a man who had ordered a hit 12 hours ago. He looked like an executive reading the Financial Times. He didn't look up when she hovered in the doorway. There's coffee in the pot on the counter. Cups are in the cabinet above it. Food is on the stove. Nora hesitated. She mapped the room. 2 exits. A rack of heavy copper pans hanging overhead. A drawer block of chef's knives near the sink. She noted them, cataloged them, and then forced her shoulders to drop. She walked to the counter, poured a mug of black coffee, and took a seat at the furthest end of the island, leaving a good 6 feet of polished wood between them. Leo turned a page of his paper. The crisp rustle filled the quiet kitchen. "Did you sleep?" "Yes," Nora lied. She had stared at the wall until 4 in the morning, listening to the rain, waiting for the doorknob to turn. Leo finally looked up. His dark eyes flicked over her face, taking in the bruised exhaustion under her eyes, the tight defensive line of her jaw. He knew she was lying, but he didn't press it. He folded the newspaper and set it aside. "Mateo called an hour ago." Leo said, his voice returning to that low, businesslike rumble. "Your father and brother didn't go south. They tried to be clever. They headed west toward Iowa. Bought a beat-up truck in cash from a scrapyard outside Joliet." Nora's grip on her ceramic mug tightened until her knuckles turned white. The hot porcelain burned her palms, but she welcomed the pain. It grounded her. "Did he find them?" "Not yet. They're moving fast, avoiding the interstates, but they're sloppy." Leo picked up his espresso cup. Declan used his personal phone to log into a banking app 3 hours ago. It pinged a cell tower near Davenport. They're boxed in. It's just a matter of tightening the net. Nora stared at the black surface of her coffee. The reflection looking back at her was pale and fractured. She felt a sickening wave of vertigo. For years, Arthur had been an immovable force of nature in her life, a towering, terrifying figure who dictated her pain, her hunger, her worth. Now sitting in this warm kitchen, hearing a man calmly discuss her father like a minor logistical error, the illusion shattered. Arthur wasn't a god. He was just a pathetic, sloppy thief running out of road. "You're shaking," Leo observed quietly. "I'm not," Nora snapped a defensive reflex. She put the mug down quickly before the tremors in her hands could spill the hot liquid. She looked away, her throat tight. I want it over. I want the waiting to be over." Leo watched her for a long moment. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't tell her everything was going to be okay. He treated her with a cold, respectful pragmatism that she found strangely comforting. "Fear is a habit," Leo said, leaning back in his stool. "Your body is still waiting for the hit. It takes time for the nervous system to realize the threat is gone. You're safe here, Nora. I don't give my word often, but you have it. No one in this house will lay a hand on you." He stood up, grabbing his suit jacket from the back of a chair. "Eat something. Maria will check on you later. I have a meeting downtown. If you need anything, tell the men at the front door." Nora watched him walk toward the hallway. Before he disappeared, she spoke. The words tasted like copper. "Mr. Russo." He stopped, turning his head slightly. "When Matteo catches them, don't let them talk their way out. Arthur is a liar, a really good one. He'll offer you anything." Leo's expression didn't change, but something dark and absolute settled in his eyes. "Arthur has nothing I want. The debt is closed. This is pest control." 3 days passed. 72 hours of agonizing, suffocating luxury. Nora learned the rhythms of the Russo estate. She learned that the guards changed shifts at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. She learned that Maria hummed old Italian folk songs when she polished the silver. She learned that Leo left the house before the sun came up and rarely returned before midnight. She spent most of her time in the sprawling library, curled up in a leather chair by the window, watching the gray Chicago sky. She read blindly, turning the pages of thick historical biographies without absorbing a single word. Her mind was caught in a brutal loop, constantly replaying the smell of accelerant, the blinding white heat of the burn, the sound of Arthur's voice telling her to stay quiet. She was healing physically. The raw edges of her burn were finally scabbing over, properly aided by the expensive antibacterial ointments Maria silently left on her bathroom counter. But internally, the rot felt deeper. She felt like a ghost, haunting a life she didn't belong to. On the evening of the 4th day, the routine broke. Nora was sitting in the library. The fire was lit, casting long dancing shadows across the mahogany shelves. She was staring blankly at the flames when the heavy double doors opened. Leo stood in the doorway. He was wearing his dark overcoat, the collar turned up against the cold. His jaw was set tight. He looked at her, and the air in the room instantly grew heavy, sucking the oxygen from her lungs. "Get your coat," Leo said. Nora froze. The book in her lap slipped, falling to the floor with a dull thud. "Matteo. They're in a warehouse in Cicero. My men just secured the perimeter." Leo didn't move from the doorway. He just waited. "We leave in 2 minutes. The nausea hit her instantly, a violent rolling wave that made her vision swim. She stood up, her legs feeling entirely hollow, like fragile glass tubes. She walked out into the hallway. Maria was already there, holding a heavy black wool peacoat. The older woman didn't smile this time. She just helped Nora slide her arms into the sleeves, her hands lingering for a brief, comforting second on Nora's uninjured shoulder. Nora followed Leo out the front door. The cold night air hit her face like a physical blow, sharp and sobering. The black SUV was idling in the driveway, exhaust pluming in the amber light of the security lamps. Leo opened the back door for her. She climbed in. He slid in beside her. The door shut. The drive was 20 minutes of agonizing silence. The city blurred past the tinted windows, neon signs, wet pavement. The headlights of civilian cars driven by people who had no idea what was sitting next to them in traffic. Nora dug her fingernails into her palms, her breathing shallow and ragged. She felt a terrifying duality tearing her apart. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand Leo turn the car around to run away and hide in a motel room until Arthur was a distant memory. The other part, the dark, broken, branded part, was starving. It wanted to see the men who burned her brought to their knees. Leo stared straight ahead, his profile illuminated intermittently by passing streetlights. "It won't look like justice," Leo said quietly, not turning his head. His voice cut through the hum of the engine. "You need to understand that before we walk in there. The movies make revenge look clean. They make it look like a settling of accounts. It's not. It's ugly. It smells like urine and fear. They aren't going to have a sudden revelation of their sins. They're just going to beg." Nora swallowed hard. "I know. You don't," Leo corrected gently. "And that's why I'm telling you. When you see a man stripped of his pride, broken down to his basic survival instincts, it changes you. If you don't want to carry that image, you stay in the car. I go in. 3 minutes later, I come out. It's done. You never have to see them again." He finally turned to look at her. The street lights caught the hard, uncompromising lines of his face. "This is your choice, Nora. The only one that matters." Nora looked down at her hands. The knuckles were white, the half-moon indents of her fingernails pressed deep into her palms. She closed her eyes. She felt the phantom heat of the welding blanket pressing into her collarbone. She heard the hiss of her own skin melting against the iron bolt. She opened her eyes. The terror was still there, but it was eclipsed by a cold, devastating finality. "I'm not staying in the car." Leo studied her for a second longer, searching for a crack in her resolve. Finding none, he gave a slow, single nod. "Okay." The SUV slowed, turning off the main street onto a potholed industrial road lined with rusted chain-link fences and dead streetlights. They pulled up to a massive corrugated metal building. There were no lights on inside, but 2 nondescript sedans were parked near a loading dock. The SUV parked. The driver killed the engine. "Stay behind me," Leo instructed, stepping out into the freezing night. The side door of the warehouse opened with a heavy metallic groan. The air inside was thick and damp, smelling of old motor oil, rat droppings, and a sharp metallic undercurrent of blood. The only light came from a pair of heavy-duty construction lamps set up in the center of the vast, empty concrete floor. Nora walked a few paces behind Leo, her boots echoing softly in the cavernous space. As they drew closer to the center of the room, the shadows peeled back to reveal the scene. 2 wooden chairs sat beneath the glaring white light of the halogen bulbs. Arthur and Declan were tied to them. Matteo stood a few feet away, casually wiping his knuckles with a rag. Another man stood by the wall, smoking a cigarette, holding a suppressed pistol by his side. Nora stopped. Her breath caught in her throat a sharp, ragged sound. Leo was right. It wasn't cinematic. It was just pathetic. Declan was weeping openly. His face was a swollen purple mess, his nose clearly broken. His clothes were filthy, stained with grease and what looked like days of dried sweat. He was shivering violently, his breath coming in pathetic, snot-filled gasps. Arthur looked worse. The blustering, terrifying patriarch who had ruled Nora's life with an iron fist was gone. He looked old. His trench coat was torn, his hair matted to his skull. One of his eyes was swollen completely shut, and a steady stream of blood dripped from his chin onto his shirt collar. When Arthur heard their footsteps, his remaining eye darted toward the darkness. As Leo stepped into the light, Arthur's body convulsed in a violent flinch. Then his gaze shifted. He saw Nora standing behind the Mafia boss. Complete, utter shock washed over Arthur's battered face. "Nora!" Arthur croaked. His voice was raw grating against the silence of the warehouse. Declan snapped his head up, his swollen eyes widening in terror. "Nora! Oh, God! Nora, tell them. Tell them to stop. Please." Nora didn't move. She felt as though she were standing at the bottom of the ocean, the pressure crushing her ribs. She stared at her brother, the boy who had casually tossed a lighter onto the accelerant, the boy who had covered his ears while she screamed, "Mr. Russo!" Arthur choked out, turning his attention back to Leo in a desperate, frantic pivot. "You have the girl. You kept her. That was the deal I gave her to you. The debt is settled. Please. We panicked. We're leaving the country. You'll never see us again." Leo didn't look at Arthur. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting in the pockets of his overcoat. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Nora. He was giving her the floor. He was giving her the power. Nora forced herself to take a step forward, then another. She stepped out from behind Leo's towering shadow and walked directly into the harsh, blinding light of the halogen lamps. She stopped 3 feet from her father. Arthur looked up at her, his expression shifting rapidly from terror to a desperate, manipulative pleading. "Nora, sweetie, you have to help us. He's going to kill us. I'm your father. You can't let him do this." "You're my father," Nora repeated. Her voice was flat, devoid of the trembling she felt in her bones. "Yes, yes. I kept a roof over your head. I protected you." Arthur practically spat the words, the blood bubbling on his lip. He leaned forward as much as the ropes would allow, his good eye locking onto hers. "It was an accident. The fire. You know it was an accident. Declan dropped the lighter. I put it out, didn't I? I saved you." The sheer audacity of the lie. The desperate, pathetic gaslighting right up to the edge of the grave. Nora felt a strange sensation wash over her. The paralyzing fear, the nausea, the terrifying weight of the moment, it all evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline disgust. She looked at this man, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't a monster. Monsters had power. Arthur was just a coward who survived by feeding on things weaker than himself. Slowly, deliberately, Nora reached up to the collar of her cashmere sweater. She gripped the soft wool and pulled it down, exposing her left shoulder. The scar was a violent, angry slash of raised tissue under the harsh halogen lights. The melted, puckered skin caught the glare. the distinct shape of the heavy iron bolt sitting directly over her collarbone, like a grotesque brand. Arthur's mouth clicked shut. He stared at the scar. He couldn't look away. "You didn't save me," Nora said, her voice dropping into a low, dead calm that echoed off the concrete walls. "You burned the evidence of your theft into my skin, and then you told me it was my rent. You traded me to a butcher to buy yourself a 3-day head start. You aren't a father, Arthur. You're just a thief." She turned her gaze to Declan. Her brother was openly sobbing now, snot running down his chin. "And you're nothing at all." Nora let go of her sweater. She turned her back on them. She didn't spit. She didn't scream. She didn't offer a dramatic parting line. She simply walked away, stepping out of the light and back into the shadow where Leo stood. "Wait!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking in sheer primal panic as he realized the manipulation had failed. "Nora!" "You ungrateful bitch, I raised you." Nora stopped beside Leo. She didn't look back. She looked up at the mob boss. His face was entirely unreadable, a mask of stone, but his dark eyes were locked on hers, waiting for the verdict. "Dispose of them." Nora whispered the words tasting like iron. "Like they disposed of me." Leo held her gaze for 1 second longer. Then he raised his right hand. A simple, dismissive wave. Nora turned and began walking toward the heavy metal door. She didn't want to see it. She made it 10 paces. Crack. The sound was deafening. It tore through the cavernous warehouse, a violent concussive wave that made Nora flinch violently, her shoulders hiking up to her ears. Crack. A second shot. Immediate. Clinical. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. It was absolute. The sobbing had stopped. The begging had stopped. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder instantly filled the damp air, overpowering the smell of rust and old oil. Nora pushed the heavy metal door open and stumbled out into the freezing night. She barely made it to the edge of the cracked pavement before her knees buckled. She hit the gravel hard, tearing the fabric of her jeans, and violently threw up. There was nothing in her stomach but coffee and bile. But her body heaved, purging the adrenaline, purging the terror, purging 24 years of Arthur's absolute control. She stayed on her hands and knees, gasping for air, tears blurring her vision. It didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like the movies. She just felt hollowed out, a scraped clean shell trembling in the cold. A shadow fell over her. Leo stood beside her. He didn't try to pull her up. He didn't offer empty platitudes about how she was safe now, or how it was over. He simply crouched down the hem of his expensive overcoat, brushing the dirty gravel, and held out a crisp white linen handkerchief. Nora looked at it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift them. She took the handkerchief, pressing it to her mouth. "Breathe," Leo commanded quietly, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaotic storm of her mind. It didn't fix it. Nora choked out a raw, devastated whisper, clutching the fabric. "They're dead, but the burn is still there. I'm still ruined." Leo looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away the bravado, looking straight into the fractured pieces of her soul. "You aren't ruined," Leo said softly. He didn't touch her. He didn't crowd her. "You're just surviving the fire. Come on, let's go home." For the first 4 days after the warehouse, Nora slept. It wasn't the peaceful, restorative sleep of the innocent. It was a brutal, exhaustive coma dictated by a nervous system that had finally run out of adrenaline. She woke only to drink water, swallow the bitter, chalky painkillers Maria left on the nightstand, and stare at the ceiling. The heavy velvet curtains remained drawn, blocking out the pale Chicago winter. When she finally emerged on the 5th day, she felt different. The crushing, suffocating paranoia that had defined her existence for 24 years was gone, but it hadn't been replaced by joy. It had been replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. The monsters under the bed were dead. The man who sold her was ash in the ground. But the burn on her shoulder still tightened every time she reached for a glass, a permanent physical receipt of the transaction. She found Leo in the library late that night. The house was completely silent, save for the low hum of the forced air heating. Leo was sitting in his leather wingback chair, the glow of a laptop screen illuminating the sharp angles of his face. A tumbler of amber liquid sat untouched on the side table. He wore a dark Henley, the sleeves pushed up, exposing the heavy cords of muscle and faded ink on his forearms. He didn't look up when her bare feet padded across the Persian rug. "Maria said you finally ate solid food," Leo murmured, his fingers steadily tapping the keyboard. "Dry toast," Nora replied. Her voice was raspy from disuse. She wrapped her oversized gray cardigan tighter around her ribs, sinking into the chair opposite him. "It tasted like cardboard. Your stomach lining is recovering from a decade of cortisol," he said, finally closing the laptop with a soft click. He leaned back, studying her in the dim light. "The nausea will pass. The phantom adrenaline takes longer." Nora pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. She didn't feel the need to posture around him anymore. The warehouse had stripped away any pretenses between them. He had seen her at her most broken. She had seen him act as the executioner. They shared a deeply ugly truth. "I thought I would feel lighter," she admitted, staring at the dead embers in the fireplace. "When Arthur died, I thought the weight would just snap, like a cut rope. But it didn't. I just feel hollow, like someone scooped out all my organs and forgot to replace them." "Revenge is a transactional lie," Leo said quietly. The ice in his glass shifted a sharp clink in the quiet room. "People think it balances the ledger. It doesn't. It just stops the bleeding. You still have to live with the scar tissue." He didn't offer her platitudes. He didn't tell her it would get better with time. He spoke to her like a fellow casualty of a violent world. "Do you ever stop seeing them?" Nora asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The people you've—" She trailed off, not wanting to say the word killed out loud in his sanctuary. Leo picked up his glass, swirling the liquid slowly. He stared into it for a long time before taking a slow sip. "No, you don't stop seeing them. But eventually they stop taking up space in the room. They become wallpaper. A reminder of why you don't let people get close enough to hold the knife." Nora looked at him, really looked at him. Beneath the tailored suits, the imposing syndicate network, and the quiet, lethal authority, there was a profound, suffocating isolation. He was a king, entirely surrounded by a moat of his own making. She let her legs down, planting her feet flat on the floor. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't map the room for exits. She just sat in the quiet with him. "Thank you," she said. Leo's brow furrowed slightly. "For what?" "For not making me stay in the car." A heavy silence settled over them, but it wasn't the jagged, terrifying silence of her past. It was grounded. It was a truce. 2 weeks later, the Chicago winter broke, giving way to a freezing torrential downpour that mirrored the night Nora had been dragged to the shipyard. Matteo found her in the kitchen reading a paperback she had pulled from the library. He didn't smile. Matteo never smiled, but his posture lacked the coiled tension it usually held when he was on the clock. "Boss wants to see you in the office," Mateo grunted, pouring himself a mug of black coffee. Nora marked her page a sudden flutter of anxiety nesting in her throat. She hadn't seen much of Leo over the last few days. The syndicate had been busy shipments moving problems arising that required his specific brand of violent arbitration. She walked down the long mahogany hallway, her leather slippers soundless on the polished wood. She stopped at the heavy oak doors and knocked once. "Come in." Leo was standing by the massive window, watching the rain lash against the reinforced glass. He wore his standard charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. On the center of his immaculate, hyper-organized desk lay a single, thick manila envelope. Nora stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an unspoken finality. "You asked to see me?" Leo turned. His face was an unreadable mask. He walked over to the desk, picked up the envelope, and held it out to her. "I made you a promise the night you arrived," he said, his voice flat, strictly professional. "I told you that once the debt was settled, you would be free to go." Nora stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a slow, painful thud against her ribs. She reached out her fingers, trembling slightly, and took it. It was heavy. She popped the metal clasp and opened the flap. Inside was a stack of crisp, perfectly banded $100 bills. Beneath the cash was a small navy blue passport, an Illinois driver's license, and a birth certificate. She pulled out the license. The photo was a digital composite cleverly altered from a picture Mateo had taken of her days ago. The name next to it read Claire Bennett. "There's $50,000 in cash." Leo listed his tone, clinical, entirely devoid of emotion. "The passport is clean. The identity is backstopped. There's a set of keys in the bottom of the envelope to a prepaid sedan waiting at a long-term parking lot at O'Hare. You can go anywhere. Start over. Buy a quiet life where no one knows Arthur's name." Nora stood frozen, the glossy plastic of the driver's license digging into her thumb. This was it. This was the fantasy she had clung to during the worst nights in Arthur's house. A clean slate, money, freedom, an open door with no strings attached. But as she stared at the fake name, a cold, suffocating dread washed over her. She looked up at Leo. He had returned to his spot by the window, his back half turned to her, watching the rain. His shoulders were rigid. The utter detachment in his posture felt like a physical blow. "You're throwing me out." Nora whispered the words, slipping out before she could catch them. Leo stiffened. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The flat professional mask cracked, revealing a flash of raw, tightly controlled frustration. "I am giving you your life back, Nora. The life that piece of shit stole from you. This isn't a game. You are a civilian. You don't belong in a house guarded by men with rifles." "I don't belong anywhere," she fired back, her voice rising, echoing sharply in the large office. The anger surged up, hot and sudden. She threw the envelope onto the desk. The heavy stacks of cash slid across the polished oak with a heavy final thud. "Do you really think I can just walk into a suburban coffee shop and pretend to be normal?" Nora demanded, closing the distance between them. Her breathing was shallow, her chest heaving. "Do you think I can sit in a cubicle and type emails while knowing what a bullet sounds like when it hits a human skull? Arthur didn't just steal my money, Leo. He broke me. He broke the part of me that knows how to exist out there." She gestured wildly toward the window, toward the city hidden in the rain. Out there, They'll look at me and see a victim," Nora said, her voice dropping into a desperate, jagged whisper. She reached up, gripping the collar of her sweater, her knuckles white. "They'll see the scar, and they'll pity me. They'll ask questions. They'll flinch. I spent my whole life flinching. I can't do it anymore." Leo stared at her. The silence stretched between them, thick and volatile. He looked at the discarded envelope on his desk, then back to the defiant, terrified woman standing in front of him. "My world is blood, Nora." Leo said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, dangerous rumble. He took a slow step toward her, the predator finally shedding its restraint. "It's extortion. It's violence. It's waking up at 3 a.m. wondering if the car engine is going to turn over or blow up. It is not a sanctuary. It is a war zone." "I know." Nora held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I grew up in a war zone, but at least here the monsters have rules." Leo stopped inches from her. The smell of his cologne, sandalwood, and petrichor was intoxicatingly grounding. His chest rose and fell in a slow, measured rhythm. He was a man fighting a violent internal war between his strict, pragmatic code and the deeply possessive, dark instinct that had been clawing at his throat since the night she walked into his warehouse. "If you stay," Leo warned, his dark eyes dropping to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes, "you don't get to change your mind when things get ugly. You don't get to look away. You become part of the ledger." "I know how to read a ledger," Nora said softly, "and I'm not afraid of the dark." Leo's jaw flexed. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand. He didn't reach for her face or her waist. He reached for the collar of her sweater. Nora's breath hitched, a reflexive, ingrained spike of panic shooting through her veins. But she didn't pull away. She forced her feet to stay rooted to the floor. Leo's calloused knuckles brushed against her collarbone. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the heavy violence she knew his hands were capable of. He gently pushed the soft cashmere aside, exposing the jagged, puckered skin of the brand. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at it with pity or disgust. He looked at it the way a soldier looks at a comrade's shrapnel wound, with absolute, unwavering respect for the survival it represented. He brushed his thumb slowly across the raised, melted flesh. The sensation sent a shiver down Nora's spine, not of fear, but of an overwhelming, profound validation. It was the ugliest part of her, the physical manifestation of her deepest shame, and he was touching it like it was armor. "Arthur branded you to guarantee your silence," Leo murmured, his thumb resting over the mark, the heat of his skin seeping into her cold flesh. His eyes lifted, locking onto hers with a dark, terrifying devotion. "I don't want your silence, Nora. I want the ghost." Nora's throat tightened. The cynical defensive shell she had worn for a decade finally irrevocably shattered. She didn't need a savior in shining armor. She needed the devil who understood the temperature of the flames. She reached up, her trembling hand wrapping around his thick wrist. She didn't push him away. She held him there, anchoring the monster to the scar. "Then keep me," she whispered. Leo didn't smile. He just lowered his head, pressing his forehead against hers. The physical contact was heavy, desperate, and entirely imperfect. It was the collision of two broken people choosing to barricade the door together. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the fortified glass of the brutalist mansion. The city of Chicago went about its day blind to the underworld breathing beneath its streets. Nora closed her eyes, the phantom ache in her shoulder fading into the warmth of Leo's palm. For the first time in her life, she wasn't collateral. She wasn't a bargaining chip. She was exactly where she chose to be. Fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just quietly surrenders to the dark. If Nora's journey into the dark side of survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Do you think she made the right choice, staying with Leo, or should she have taken the money and run? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your theories on what happens next. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves gritty, slow-burn romance. And subscribe to the channel with the bell turned on so you never miss our next deep dive into the criminal underworld. See you next time.